Leanda for the warm welcome, and also to the esteemed panelists that we'll be sharing the afternoon session with. But also greetings to you all from a warm and sunny Lilongwe. I would have loved to be there, but circumstances were beyond control. And I'm glad that we have the virtual space that I could be following the conversations from the morning till now. I will share my screen, and once I put up my screen, I'll possibly just also minimize my, my video, and I'll put it up later just to conserve the bandwidth that we have. Okay, great, thank you. So to kick it off, we'll be presenting on some of the best practices, but also challenges when it comes to tracking climate finance. Just to confirm if you can see my screen.
Yes, we can see it, Chikondi.
Perfect. So let me start with an introduction, and it's going to be a good leeway from what was discussed this morning. Let's start with the commitments that were made in 2009. In 2009, countries committed to make sure that they are adapting, but they are also mitigating when it comes to combating climate change. It was agreed that we should be financing 100 billion a year by 2020 going towards climate action. So we all know, and with the great introduction we had this morning, countries need money to address the climate crisis now. We have heard of how climatic impacts are affecting agriculture, they're affecting health, and all facets of development, not just in Africa, but globally. As we have seen the trend, many southern countries in the global south, including countries like Tanzania, have to borrow money to make sure that they maintain climate action and they are able to respond to the mounting impacts of the climate crisis. Despite that, most of the countries in the global south are responsible for just 7% of the global emission. We are still being faced with 75 to 80% of the cost of climate change. In Malawi, I'm sure you have all heard, we have just gotten over the Cyclone Freddy, but the trauma is still there. We are still meeting the impacts of Cyclone Freddy, and they are going to be here for a while, as most countries would attest to. My presentation this morning will be following the 3 reports that CARE has been able to publish within the past few years. So we'll be looking at climate adaptation, fact of action, or hollow commitments, or also saying double. All these are available if you Google, but I'll also make sure that I provide the links to the organizers and to Luyanda. So I have talked about the commitment of 100 billion that was made by countries for climate action. And this 100 billion was for the rich nations to provide to southern countries. Out of the pledged amount, out of the 100 billion that was committed to, 50 billion has been pledged by 2020. This is the statistics that we got. But out of that, only 17 billion had been mobilized. And out of that, only 10 billion is being, there's about 10 billion that we believe is being over-reported when it comes to issues of transparency. There is an aspect of our reporting that we kind of get at all levels when it comes to money that's coming for climate finance, because as it stands, some of the money that is meant for development is also being touted as climate finance. So this is the picture I've shared. So where is this money that's being given? Most of this money that's being given is say that is money that is going to support health education and other poverty alleviation indicators. But that is being reported as a general aspect. The physical realities of climate change are adding substantial cost. climatic money is supposed to be different money as agreed in the Paris Agreement. But what is happening is we're seeing money that is being diverted, meant to tackle poverty, going towards other developmental aspects. When combined, we only have about 57 billion a year, a little more than half of the collective commitment that was made. So when we look at this graph, this is the money that has been reported as climate finance, 295. But out of this money that's been reported, this is money that we call additional to the level of development finance. So out of 295, 141 is what we are calling additional, because this is you can claim to say this is finance for climate or this is finance for development. But this is how the reporting is happening by rich nations that owe the global south and have the responsibility for climate finance in terms of, when it comes to fair shares. So in this conversation as we're going, I just wanted to quote Mia Mottley, the Prime Minister of Barbados. She said that we are shown that small island states and developing countries are having large debt because of corruption and profligacy, when in fact, a lot of that debt is coming in because of the climate crisis. A report recently by ActionAid, and also the Bretton Woods, has agreed that there is this over-reporting that's going on, but also because of this over-reporting, countries still need to adapt, still need to vindicate. And due to that, we are still seeing more and more countries going into debt to cover for the deficit that was meant to be covered by that 100 billion. And if you really look at it, the 100 billion is a drop in the bucket. I'll get back to that later. I just wanted to share this because of issues of debt. We are having this vicious cycle of climate crisis and increasing public debt to cover for the deficit when it comes to climate action. There's higher borrowing, priority or debt repayments are continuing, there's reduced fiscal space, reliance on natural resources and fossil fuels to repay debt, and then there are increased impacts of climate emergency. They don't stop, whether you're in debt or not. Climate impacts are still coming, as IPCC have shared. And countries now find themselves in a situation where they have to borrow for climate adaptation and mitigation investment. They borrow for recovery and reconstruction, as we have seen in the recent cyclones that have been hitting, the flooding that has been taking place, but also the drought that we're experiencing. We borrow for recovery and reconstruction, and then there is the public finance in the form of loans that's coming in, and then higher borrowing, meaning more and more countries are becoming vulnerable, and there's the increased public. So there's that cycle that we are finding ourselves in just because of climate action and because of lack of fulfilling the commitments. Just to give you a picture of how much is going in terms of money that's been mobilized. Money that's been mobilized here, most of it, you see 31% in 2020 was from the public, 36 was from multilateral donors, export credits, but also mobilized private money. This is usually an aspect of rich countries not keeping their word. They want to give you the money, but you have to get it as a loan. The needs keep growing, and many rich countries are using dishonest and misleading accounting to inflate their climate finance contribution to countries. And I thought that this was useful in the conversation that we're having on transparency. There are more loans and less grants. When it comes to climate justice, and I'll borrow the words of the morning panelist, climate justice is an issue where it is, those who caused the problem own up to the problem. But what we are seeing is a reverse, where those who did the least to cause the problem are now being taken in charge of fixing the problem through loans. There are interest rates that are going, and lower income countries have more interest rates than higher income countries, as we have seen. So now we have talked about the money, we have talked of the loans aspect. I just wanted to now say, okay, with the money that is coming in, there is money. Where is that money going? So these are the countries that are benefiting most from climatic funds. And from our continent here, we have South Africa, but we also have, I think that's the only country that we have that is African that is sort of benefiting from this. But it is usually coming in the form of loans, as I have alluded to earlier. Why is financing low? So the reasons that we get from the research and from several studies is that there's less, most of the countries in Global South are requesting for money on adaptation, and the adaptation is less of a priority to countries of the Global North. Despite the national adaptation plans and national action plans, mentioning adaptation as a high priority, this is not the same message that we get from the rich countries. There is a general perception that adaptation projects are public goods and they have little or no potential for business or private investment opportunities. Just to give you an example, right here, I think we are in Tanzania. We're in Tanzania here, we're seeing more of the money coming in as adaptation and mitigation and less coming in as adaptation finance. This is the picture of the commitments that we're getting in terms of millions, and also taking into consideration constant prices. There are no, and the other aspect that we get from development banks, macros, etc., is that there are no clear models around cost, returns, viability, and timelines when it comes to adaptation financing. That's why we have this picture. So we have looked at why we are getting, how we're getting money and where the money is going, and why we're getting less money also for adaptation. That is a priority for the continent. We said, okay, let's just get a feel of how it's happening globally. How is funding coming in terms of climate adaptation finance for Africa and also for the globe? These are some of the results that we found, and we really wanted to find out that money that's coming in to be claimed as adaptation finance. How is it benefiting the poor and the most climate vulnerable parts of the population? So this is sort of a picture of international climate finance that was mapped around 2013 to 2017. I know years have passed, but the picture is not far different from what you see here. There are 111 projects, around 6.1 billion from 25 donors that were checked to see how much they are bringing in. So just to go back to Japan, in Japan, there was 282 million to build the Natan Bridge. Japan gave money to Vietnam to build the Natan Bridge, 282 million. It was said this is 100% climate adaptation finance. However, with our study found out that 282 of this is an over-report of what has been on the ground in terms of adaptation finance. Another funding from Japan said the North-South Expressway, it gave 150 million as adaptation. It was climate adaptation. However, this is also over-reported finance because it's an infrastructure project, yes, but it's all being touted as climate adaptation. There's a housing project in Nepal that was also a 500 million US dollars, and 428 was reported as climate adaptation. But what we found was that $328 million was over-reported. We go to Ethiopia, $600 million was for a rural productive assets safety net project in Ethiopia. 52% of that was reported as climate adaptation. However, we found that 106 million was an over-report of that. So this is the picture that we are getting. The key message from there is that adaptation finance is being reported as adaptation finance is being over-reported, and also the estimates that are there on under-reporting are at 0.2 billion. So more and more of the reports that go as climate finance is being touted as climate adaptation, but it is an issue of over-reporting based on the statistics and the formulas that they're using. So a thematic split, just to understand, more money coming in as adaptation and more money for mitigation. We are seeing here in 2019, we had 50.8. That was 50.8 billion. That was for mitigation, and this 20.1, that's for adaptation. And if you take into consideration some of the over-reporting that we have seen in some of the projects, this figure would definitely go lower. But that's the stark reality that we are faced with. And then there are also other aspects that we need to be aware of. There is debt for climate or nature swaps, there are green bonds, blue bonds, nature performance bonds, risk insurers, but also private finance, that also being touted as adaptation coming in the name of climate adaptation, but it is a loan, but also the burden is mostly placed on the poor people. So that's the reality that we are finding ourselves when it comes to transparency of this climate finance from the global level and in terms of the donors. So in terms of how financial, even though there's little money coming in, we still need to account for that in the countries that receive this money. And my fellow panelists will delve more into that. But there are 5 principles of mainstreaming climate action. One, there's that commitment to climate strategies. We have the national adaptation plans, the NAPAs, and other climate policies that are in place that are there to manage the risk, promoting climate smart objectives. We have heard of Humudza this morning. Then also include improving climate performance, but also accounting for your climate action. Those are the principles. What you commit to, you need to account for. So that's the picture in terms of adopting. I wanted to share this example from Ghana, where climate action is being put into public financial systems. And the reason why I started from the high level is transparency needs to start from where the money is coming from to the end user, even with the governments. So this is a picture, is an example. I know there are more countries that have similar, but I just pick Ghana now, where they have integrated climate action into their policies and plans. And these are the strategies that they have put in place and have integrated climate action. Then also in terms of political leadership, this is important when it comes to making sure climate action is embedded. There is the Interministerial National Climate Change Committee, which includes the Ministry of Health and the Ghana Health Services. This is for political leadership and buy-in, but also there's a funding mechanism in place where Ghana has received external funding to carry out projects, but also this, although I've mentioned this, it is unclear to what extent the funding exists for climate and health, although plans earmarked such as budgets have been outlined. Then there are also challenges that we need to be aware of. I've mentioned of the issue of having low money coming in on adaptation. There is insufficient finance because of over-reporting and lack of transparency from the rich nations. But also when it comes to countries, there's coordination between ministries that is lacking. Sometimes money that is coming into Ministry of Health and can cut some of the climate action is not disclosed. So there is that siloed approach between ministries that we have seen. And this is also in Ghana. But also there's limited understanding of what adaptation is. Though it could be in the adaptation plan, not all countries have a national adaptation plan in place. And the numbers sometimes are developed and put on the shelf and not really used when it comes to utilizing the money. But also, when this money comes in, sustaining the gains after the closure of projects is a huge issue. So these are some of the challenges when it comes to climate action into public financial systems. It is important to track climate finance from the source to the end user because it really helps in increasing transparency, but also there is trust. As I've shared with you, as it is now, global South countries have sort of lost trust because there are only a few countries from the global North that are taking charge in terms of owning up to the commitments. We have a few good examples that we have seen in the reports, and I'll ask you to look at that, who have taken an initiative to own up to what they are committing to. And then when it comes to countries, it's really important to make sure that when we're doing our national reporting, support received versus support needed is really helpful to kind of align the specific requirements from the rich nations. When it comes to planning, budgeting, and awareness, it's also important to track this because we understand how much we are mobilizing domestically, how much is coming internationally to cover for the climate finance, and then also for resource mobilization. It's important to track because it will act as a basis for different ministries to work together, also for the governments and donors to prioritize in terms of resource mobilization because you're able to track. When you're properly tracking your finances, it's easy to say, this money that's coming in is mostly for mitigation, but this is where our needs are because of this. So we use this tracking to really support also in resource mobilization and moving forward. So how do we do things now moving forward? So as African countries, we need to continuously align climatic action to our nationally determined contribution papers, but also our national adaptation plans. But we also need to consider creating national adaptation financing frameworks that are aligned to public resource management. That is really important. We really need to address the barrier, have a strong business case, have innovative mechanisms where adaptation needs are being funded, and then also having additional domestic resources, having a regionality of responses because we know climatic action sees no borders, having mitigation finance for adaptation outcomes, but also establishing a national register. This is just an example of how we could make sure that we're doing things differently moving forward, really using the NAP and NDC to guide where the money goes. I wanted to also say that as we are doing that for countries, the governments, the rich nations, they really need to see how they could own up, increase the financing that is coming in, either through climate damages task on the fossil fuel industry. So we know some countries are not stopping using fossil fuel industry. So what we're saying is let's tax that industry and use that money to support in adaptation activities. There's needs for redirection of fossil fuel subsidies, but also there's need for levies on air passenger travel. And I know colleagues in the room have, some have used travel, but let's see how we could use that, those levies to also go into to that conversation. Then there's also need for debt cancellation for countries that we know are being constantly hit by these climatic impacts, because really it is a cycle that we are creating if we do not cancel that debt. For developed countries as well, we must renew our efforts to adhere to the spirit of the International Aid Transparency Initiative. Really important because we are really being played ball. I think if I could say it in the most basic words, that we are being told money is coming in, but it is coming in as loans, but then also there's that over-reporting aspect that's coming in. So we really need to be transparent what the money is coming to do. Funding for climate finance is not ODA. We really need to be clear on that. Then also we need to be clear on following through existing obligations regarding transparency and build upon them to facilitate public access to, and also project documentation. It was really difficult in carrying out some of the reports that I've shared and coming up with these results because there is that, we hide information. So that hiding of information really, does not go well with our aspect of transparency. Now, for multilateral banks, especially the World Bank, they think there's need to renew their efforts to report only on the incremental cost of adaptation in their projects as adaptation finance, and not frame everything as adaptation finance. As I wrap up, I would like to say this. We need deliberate approaches for accessing and scaling up climate finance flows, especially for adaptation projects and programs. And this can only happen if we are moved as the narrative, where when financing is coming in, we're not being helped. This needs to be, we are being partners in tackling the climate crisis, because whether we like it or not, climatic impacts see no borders, and they will get to others in no time. Then the other aspect is we need to develop a pipeline of bankable projects and explore how we could have diverse financial instruments for adaptation beyond grants and loans, including having innovative instruments specific to Africa, but also specific to vulnerable islands and states. We also need to see how we could play a huge role in providing catalytic capital to de-risk private investments in adaptation actions in Africa. Transparency, as I've said, has to be at all levels in climate finance. As we are asking for transparency within governments, please be aware that this aspect of hiding information, over-reporting, etc., is starting from where the money is supposed to come from. And more importantly, we need to scale and speed for climate finance in Africa, but also beyond, because the impacts are really happening at a speed that governments are unable to cope with. I would like to thank you for your attention, and you can reach out to me for any further discussion.
This presentation and some reports from the African Development Bank, what we get is the figures.